Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio. We're the weekly radio news magazine put together by the Virginia Institute for Public Policy so that you can go out with these crazy little wacky things we like to call facts rather than opinions, because opinions are warm and fuzzy and they're fun to play with, but they aren't necessarily, what good policy and good decisions are made of. And in this post-gaslighting world where everyone needs you to follow them so that they can get power, so that, they can get power, we just need to be a little bit more detached from the warm, fuzzy feelings of rhetoric and actually look at what's going on there. And our first guest to do that, Andy Roth, is back on the program. He's with AB2 Consulting, working with the Club for Growth for many years. And I think the last time he was on with us, still with the Club for Growth, now working with them to put together their scorecard initiative. Andy, welcome back to the program. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
And we appreciate everything you do, because this is like kryptonite to rhetoric. Maybe that's why if you go to the Club for Growth website, it's all in green. But it is, if you want to diffuse the hyperbole of, the warm feelings of either side, and I think the Republicans can be just as guilty of this, hiding in rhetorical answers to serious questions that have policy ramifications. It's like the Republicans who will deny the reality of poverty because it's not a winner for them. It just opens the door up to their progressive opponents. And I appreciate this. Clubforgrowth.org is where you see it. For years, obviously, the scorecard has laid the wood to the House and the Senate, and you can actually go back through previous congressional legislations, and you can even look into how they put together the vote scoring. Andy, just as a thumbnail sketch, take people through how you do these scorecards for the voter.
Sure thing. And you're right. Since 2005, the Club for Growth has been doing a congressional scorecard at the federal level. So we looked at all of the roll call votes taken in the House, all the roll call votes taken in the Senate. We find the ones that are economic votes. So we don't do cultural issues or social issues. And we take those economic issues and we find out what are the most revealing votes. What are the votes that truly reflect how these individual politicians vote? And we typically have about 15 to 20 votes for each chamber. And they include tax increases, tax cuts, regulation, deregulation, spending, trade, tort reform, all the hallmarks of economic freedom. And we've been doing that since 2005. But last year, we decided to do an audit of all of the state-based scorecards that currently exist across the country. And we found that the state-level politicians are not being held accountable
which is
enough.
Sad.
So we decided that we needed to start producing state scorecards. And we produced one recently in Virginia, but we also have them in Florida, Tennessee, Texas, Missouri. And our hope is that over the next few years, we can have 50 scorecards in 50 states. And we want to be able to produce those on an annual basis so that people can hold their members of Congress accountable, but also their state-level representatives as well.
I remember there was a guy running for president years ago, and we were struggling a little bit economically, and his campaign was all built on the phrase, "It's the economy, stupid." It's his reminder to himself. Of course, he was a Democrat and didn't actually govern that way, but it made for a good point, and it is a good point, because the better we all are at being able to pay our bills, to pay our, car payments and our rent or mortgage, and stick some away on the side, the more likely we are to feel satisfied with the country, the more likely we are to focus on things that matter, like family and our communities. And moreover than that, we all start to remember that freedom is really economic freedom. That oppression comes when you have to sell out because you just need to get to the next bill payment and things like that. And to me, that's one of the messages that much to I'm sure the chagrin of his campaign consultants, President Trump in 2016 went to all these inner city Detroit churches where any reasonable Republican campaign consultant would say, "Don't waste a day going there. You're not going to win that precinct." But I'll bet you he won over enough votes that helped throw Michigan into his electoral map. And there are real issues in these inner cities and in these impoverished communities, whether it's racial or not. It takes away one of the great campaign fulcrums of the American left because you're able to pay your own bills. And I don't think I'm overstating that, am I, Andy?
No, in fact, I would take it just a little bit further. We had 8 years of abysmal economic growth under Obama. And when President Trump started campaigning, everybody laughed him off because they were like, no way can this reality TV show guy win the presidency. But because people have been so fed up with those 8 years, and because their economic situation, their family situation, their ability to earn money and earn a living and provide for their family, because they have suffered for 8 years, they needed anybody who would finally listen to them. And Trump tapped into that.
Oh, yeah.
And he is the guy that represented the low-income and middle-income people in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin, all those Rust Belt states that said, finally, we've got somebody who's willing to speak for us. Mm-hmm. And so that's the interesting message going into 2020 is that the Democrats are tripping over themselves talking about inequality and pushing the boundaries of socialism. And I think it's just fascinating that a lot of people still haven't figured out that it's the economy, stupid.
Well, and beyond that, it is, if there's a vibrant economy full of various businesses all running around for the same customer base, it forces prices down and wages up. I mean, it is the classic example. I love listening to young people who don't seem to understand that Adam Smith's idea of an economy isn't even close to where we are right now. But at least with the president, there seems to be somebody who gets the fact that if there's 6 people all trying to hire you, you're going to get a higher wage. And by the way, those companies are going to be better responsive to the customer.
Yeah, and just look at all the hallmarks of economic growth. The unemployment rate is at its lowest point ever. Mm-hmm. I remember during the Clinton years, we were like, the unemployment rate is so low, people were worrying about inflation and about, mm-hmm. all of this wage growth. And I never thought that it could go any lower, but it has. Yep. And that's because the economy is so robust. And I think one of the things that isn't being talked about is just how, just with regulations, how the government has kind of taken their heel off of the small business yep. owner. And so it's things like that are really, bringing life to this economy. And when you combine it with technological productivity and all the good things and all the innovations that are going on, I think we've got a really good future ahead of us as long as we don't let Washington take control back.
Andy Roth is on with us, consultant with the Club for Growth, having been with them for 15 years as Vice President of Government Affairs, now with AB2 Consulting. Andy, let's get into Virginia, because you mentioned Washington just before, but Richmond has just as much regulatory. I remember a Republican gleefully telling me they had just passed a bill that would give farmers permission to sell their produce on their farms, and I stopped and I looked at it and I said, what? we needed to actually write a law in 2015, I think it was, that gave farmers permission to sell the stuff they grow at their farm. It was crazy. But that's Virginia's sort of leftover vestiges of King's Grant and things like that. So you've done a scorecard on Virginia's governance and the General Assembly. Give first a little idea of what you looked at. You said mainly economic votes, correct?
Yeah, that's right. Because of the Trump tax cuts, there was a tax cut package, which is the good news. Mm-hmm. There was a huge bill that that returned a lot of money back to the taxpayers. In fact,
people just
listening to
getting
this
them.
show may have already received a check from the government for a refund as part of that bill. And that's nice, but then the General Assembly turned around and raised taxes for transportation, for roads. So they give with one hand and take with the other. There were a lot of other bills I could go on about. There was a minimum wage increase bill. There was subsidies, of course, for Amazon, their second headquarters, but there was also subsidies for Micron Technologies. There was subsidies for solar panels. Politicians in Richmond are debating whether to license and regulate music therapy, which I wasn't aware was a thing, but apparently it is.
Apparently it's out of control.
Yeah, and there's also subsidies for rural grocery stores, and there were a few healthcare bills. So it was quite a mixed bag of bills and votes that we looked at.
Well, you mentioned subsidy, and I like the use of that phrase because there are people who say, "Oh, they're tax incentives." Well, isn't that just a tacit admission from a politician or a government office holder or even a bureaucrat that our tax structure is part of why businesses aren't growing? If you have to give tax abatements or tax subsidy to get a business to grow, shouldn't that tell you something?
Exactly. Tax incentives are basically just spending through the tax code. And the reason why you know that it's a subsidy is because certain companies benefit from it, but other companies don't. And so you're creating an unlevel playing field where politicians get to pick winners and losers, and the winners are typically well-connected, well-financed companies with lobbyists who are able to convince these lawmakers to give them money. While the small businesses, the one without lobbyists, they're the ones that are forced to compete against those people. And so it's incredibly unfair. And exactly to your point, rather than have high taxes with incentives thrown into the code to create an unlevel playing field, instead what we should have is a low, fair tax rate that applies to everybody. And that is the most pro-growth way that you can spur on the economy.
Oh, absolutely. It goes back to what was at the root of the Taxed Enough Already campaign. It's why there were Democrats, Libertarians, and Republicans at some of those early 2009 Tea Parties, was not because we were kooky, guys who just like to dress up in Revolutionary War costume, but because the acronym was Taxed Enough Already. You've got X billions of dollars every year from us. Live with it. Stop, thinking that you're some sort of neat little venture capital firm that can invest our money. So how, Andy, how did Virginia do in your first examination of their budgetary and fiscal management?
I would say not very well at all. As the majority in Richmond is only barely held by the Republicans. It's 21-19 in the Senate, and then it's 51-49 in the House. So just the Republicans are barely hanging on. But instead of promoting an agenda that's all about limited government, low taxes, you had a lot of Republicans side with Democrats and vote for the things that we just talked about, like tax increases, subsidies, more spending. The average Republican score in the Virginia Senate on our scorecard was only 55%. When I went to school, that was a failing grade. That was an F.
Oh my God! Yeah.
And the average for Republicans in the House wasn't much better at only 63%. The Democrats were at 15% and 19%. So at least they were somewhat consistent to their stated agenda. But Republicans are apparently going out there and saying, I'm for low taxes, low spending, but then they go to Richmond and betray the taxpayer. So it's really upsetting to see these scores, and I hope that by putting this out, we bring some sort of accountability to these people so that they'll shape up or ship out.
Now, you're not a political consultant, and I have arbitered this from this chair for some time, that I think some of this comes from the wave election in 2017, where Terry McAuliffe and Brian Moran caused a riot in our flagship city of Charlottesville just to get, the Democratic Party base excited for perhaps one of the most milquetoasty candidates ever to carry a D on his lapel, Ralph Northam. And that wave drove a lot of people into the polls. But the Republicans are reacting as if this, and I guess it's fair to always campaign like you're behind, but the 14 seats the Republicans lost seem to be almost like a call to arms to go the other direction, to act more like Democrats in an effort to stave off electoral obsolescence.
Yeah, and it's curious as to what's driving their misguided belief in that, and I just don't know. And maybe it is political consultants. Maybe it's just that they're completely out of touch with the voters. It's really hard to say, but they will lose the majority, and they will lose their mandate, and they will lose their credibility if they do not start acting like conservatives.
And that's where I think your numbers speak to it. 15 and 16% Club for Growth scores for the Democrats of the House and Senate in Virginia. But if Republicans stay home, I don't know. It's like damned if you do, damned if you don't, Andy. If we punish Kirk Cox and the Republican majority for not being as conservative as they could be, well, we're going to get Democrats who are 40% less conservative than they are. I hope they win, but I hope your message resonates with them. Have you talked to any members of leadership or any members of the House? What has the reaction been to the Club for Growth scorecard?
Well, it's exactly what you would expect it to be, is that they say, oh, the Club for Growth is just a special interest group out of Washington. They don't have any idea what's going on. They're out of touch, and these votes are more complicated than you think. It's all of the typical spin that you
And that's
expect.
Republicans saying that? I mean, I could expect Creed Deeds to say that, but if Republicans are saying that, I just my heart breaks.
And let me make another note, is that, like I said earlier, we do these scorecards all across the country, or at least we're trying to. And when we were doing it, every time I looked at Virginia, I thought about Florida, because we did a Florida scorecard.
Yeah.
And believe it or not, the two states are pretty similar. At the federal level, they are kind of considered a swing state.
Sure.
I know Virginia is less so over the years.
Yeah.
But they're in session about the same amount of time, just a few months every year. But Florida is able to, just voting, there were over 4,000 floor votes in Virginia. In Florida, there was only 600. In Florida, they get in there, they do the people's business, and then they leave.
Wow.
In Virginia, it seems like they're staying around trying to figure out how to create more mischief. And in Florida, it's very conservative. It's a very conservative legislature, even though, Florida has got a lot of blue and purple areas to it. And the reason why Florida is so successful is because voters know exactly who the Republicans are.
And what
they like them for it. And it's because they like low taxes, they like low regulations, and they like low government spending. And so Florida, for a long, long time, has had a history of just getting into Tallahassee, voting to protect the taxpayer, and then leaving. And I when I was looking at that, I kept thinking, well, why can't Virginia do that? Why can they not get into Richmond, vote for the taxpayer, and then leave, and then find success at the ballot box? And I'm just not seeing that.
Well, and it's interesting. You're not the first person on this program to cast aspersions towards Virginia's governance in reference to Florida. We've talked about this with energy reform and free market solutions towards energy distribution and breaking up Dominion's monopoly and things like that, and other issues regarding business growth and entrepreneurship. And it's just fascinating, this bastion of Northeasterners that are supposedly all flocking to to Florida. Maybe these are the ones that used to keep New York at least somewhat conservative in areas have finally fled all down to Florida and have some of that policy. Or maybe it is, truly, if you have the guts to make it stick, you will see it, win out in the day. Are there things that we could do easily outside of just observing and say be more like them, Andy, in your observations in this first scorecard on state legislatures? Are they doing things in any substantive way formatically different?
Well, what I would say, and you bring this point up earlier, is that, you asked about the feedback from Richmond regarding our scorecard. What I would urge people to do is to look at our scorecard at clubforgrowthfoundation.org, find their member that represents them, their members, both senator and delegate in Richmond, and write down their score and send it to that member and ask them why they got that score, good or bad. But I would ask them to take it one step further, because like I said, they'll just say, they scored it badly, they're just a special interest group. Then I would ask them, well, why did you vote this way on this bill? And there are plenty of bills in here that you can ask them about. Right. And then they can't hide as easily, because if the bill is to give subsidies out for solar panels, it's really hard to spin the truth on that. So I would have them defend their score and defend their votes, and I would urge everybody to go ask them right now.
Well, and that's one of the things that I love about what you do with your scorecards, and I'm really appreciative, though depressed at the results, that you're doing it on Virginia and other state level, because I think that there's so much that goes on at those state levels that if the president continues to be successful at rolling back these bureaucrats in Washington, is going to fall more on the shoulders of our governors and our state delegates and senators, is that we see them. As I once said to Lars Larson, the nationally syndicated talk show host, you said, you're so lucky. You can bash on AOC or something she said and be fairly comfortable you're never, ever going to see her. Me, if I'm critical of David Toscano or Cree Deeds or Rob Bell or Bryce Reeves, I'm going to run into them at a store or in an event or a picnic, or I'm going to be in the same. So we actually have the opportunity to hold these folks accountable face to face, because, we live in a state where we can bump into our delegates and our senators much more frequently.
That's exactly right. That is exactly right. In fact, that's what the founders envisioned, was more government is more accountable the closer it is to home.
Right. And
so I just love the idea of bringing accountability to these state level lawmakers. And let me make one more point. There are 7,300 state lawmakers all across the country, and they are writing laws, and they are making laws, and this is higher taxes, regulations, more restrictive health care, and there is very little accountability that we could see on those 7,300 lawmakers. And so this is just the first step in one of the first states, and I hope that we can really change the country around just by bringing more accountability with these scorecards.
Well, Andy, thank you so much for your visit. And again, it's clubforgrowthfoundation.org.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes. You'll see the scorecard for Virginia there, and you'll see a couple of other states. And I hope that if you like what you see, you take it and share it on social media.
Well, and help support them in what they do as well, because it is Herculean, the task, and going through all this stuff. And bless you for doing it, Andy, and you have a wonderful weekend.
Great. Thank you, and have a great week yourself.
When we come back on Freedom and Prosperity Radio, Michael Barone with the American Enterprise Institute on how America's political parties change and how they don't. It may be very similar to what Andy and I were just talking about with you here on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.